as you'll see, the fixation on Herodotus has been intense and remains that. So that is one reason for my being here. One other reason that I will just say right at the start is that I think I'm the only former officer of organizations like the Organization of American Historians, Society of American Historians, who says and believes and thinks that there is a kind of theological dimension to what historians do. It's never figures in presidential speeches at our associations, but what historians do is that they, at the bedrock, they lend their life force and their voice to the people of the past who death has silenced. And that is the core of this enterprise, and that's why it matters, and good luck finding that in presidential addresses at the associations. So, and I say that for all kinds of reasons, and I hope it gets said more often. I'm also one of the few people who thinks in 2020, where is the Greek chorus when we need it? Where is the group of people who have, I don't know if the members of the Greek chorus really were completely homogenized in their point of view. They certainly had sharp perspectives and understandings, but where could I find them on public radio, or where could I find the Greek chorus? It's a time where it would be so excellent to have such figures appearing in our lives. And then in general, my theme here is that something unfortunate has happened in history departments where the great majority of the historians in a department work in the 20th century. The pile up in the 20th century, some people doing 19th century, and great rarity of the full time depth. And classics, of course, has often been moved over to another department, so you don't have them, the classicists in your midst. And to my opinion, one of the great things we have in our favor as historians is that depth and time, which we seem to be forfeiting. So as you can see, I agree wholeheartedly with our previous speaker who talked about the dysfunction in history departments. Yes. Now our dirty laundry is out in the world, so it probably always has been, so better to move on with that. So I have a friend, Randy Olson. He is a scientist who studies coral reefs, and he got very concerned about how scientists communicate with the public. And so he has shifted gears in lots of ways. He does less with coral reefs and more on how we can make ourselves clear to student audiences as well as to public audiences. And he offers what he calls the ABT, which is the and, but, therefore construction. So it's basically the Hegel thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But he says that he has friends who have put willing subjects in MRI machines, and if you use and, but, therefore, for people in MRIs or CAT scans, their neurons will fire. That is an inherently dynamic, it's not necessarily a tribute to the quality of the thought, but if you use and, but, therefore, people are with you. So the bad part of and, but, therefore is that it is so effective that once you have said your and, but, therefore opening, your talk is basically over. So Owen can say, you made your point. So, but he won't do that because he's a kind person. You can tell that just to look at him. So here is my Randy Olson style and, but, therefore for today. The field of, okay, so we start with our assertions of how things are now. That is the and section. The field of study called American history has been fragmented and fractured into hundreds of subfields focused on differing dimensions of human activity and experience, political, cultural, social, economic, and so on, and split on differing tracks of experience shaped by ethnicity, gender, class, occupation, and belief. And this fragmentation and fracturing has set off a prolonged backlash of defensiveness, dismay, and resentment, and a refusal of blame, and to counter that, or to go with that refusal of blame, a strident claim of innocence. Okay, but then you put the dynamic, but, okay, so we have fragmentation and we have a strong reaction against that. But much of this fragmentation and fracturing actually originated in good intentions and originated in an aspiration to pay attention to groups and topics that had long been ignored or dismissed. And then, therefore, we can and should seek an alternative to the fragmentation and fracturing of American history by placing American history in a much bigger and deeper sweep of time. And that is best achieved by quoting frequently from Herodotus, in case you wondered, but not exclusively from Herodotus. It's just that's the person for whom I'm the biggest cheerleader. And also in the therefore, and maybe by making intergenerational transitions into a central focus of our teaching, speaking, and writing. So to take American history and to see what happens really easily when you start thinking about how to organize the writing, the teaching, the speaking about American history, it just goes so easily into the format of thinking who did what and what happened to those that were their the folks who were their children and their successors. So if you start with the British colonies and you start with Massachusetts Bay, you have the founding generation, and really fast you have the second generation that is not pulling it off. So that you have to have the halfway covenant, which is, you think we're having trouble with baby boomers and millennials. Whew, the Puritans really had that covered with the halfway covenant. So you can just keep going wherever you would like to go with that. The revolutionary generation, the founders, those who followed them, and the tensions and puzzlement over that, the folks who were shaped by the Civil War, and the people who followed them, the post-Civil War. If you just keep tracking that, it works. Immigrants and the second generation of immigrants and the transitions from the first generation to the second generation. I think it is a way to give coherence back to the teaching of American history, and also to focus on what we cannot mistake, which is that the baby boomers are not doing a great job, speak as one, in their transition, handing off the baton to the next generations. We are not winning prizes right now. We could win prizes. We don't know who gives the prize, but we're not winning the prizes. So no prizes until we figure out how to win them. This is a long way of saying that phrase that is everywhere these days, okay, boomer, okay, boomer. I am the biggest fan of that okay, boomer phrase. I see it as an olive branch between generations, and maybe an olive branch that is kind of whittled into a sharp point at the end, which some olive branches can have that. But I do not see it as any way of saying anything but, okay, boomer, what now? Exit strategy? What's your plan? So if you frame your American history class by intergenerational transactions and transitions, you come right into the present with a really, really good way of talking about our situation today. So that ABT thing is good, huh? My speech. American history is fragmented, but it came out of good intentions, of efforts at inclusivity. Therefore, we must try to think in a larger range of time. That might calm down the tensions on it, and we might think about intergenerational transitions. So how do we put it back together? I think we have some ways we can do that today. So, and I just want to say one of the places outside of classrooms where you can see this dilemma at its most vexing and most seemingly hopeless, but not, is with monuments and memorials. Monuments and memorials and plaques and tributes to the past. The Confederate memorials lead with that. We certainly, in Western American history, we have our own sites of Indian massacres. We have the Spanish conqueror, Juan de Oñate, who cut the foot off the men in the Acoma Pueblo when he conquered the Pueblo. He lives on in bronze. There is a statue of Oñate where every now and then in the night, activists cut his foot off. So don't think the Confederate statues have a monopoly on these tensions. We are really right in the midst of it. Each of those opportunities is a spectacular opportunity for conversation about history. The worst thing that happens is when people yawn about history and say, I never liked that. It's all facts and dates. It's not facts and dates. It's strong feelings. It's a place that cries for the intervention of thoughtful people mustering tranquility and going in. I've used the phrase managed contention sites and talking to National Park Service people, anticipate the contention, and I call it a managed contention site because Park Service employees are feds and they like acronyms. So then you can have MCSs and they like that because it's a, let's have an MCS. Oh yes, what is an MCS? Oh yes, let's do that. So anyway, every classroom has the same great potential to be a managed contention site. So now I want to explain what I got from having a required Western Civ class. This is the only time I've had this invitation. So I appreciate Robert Jackson. I appreciate you people so much because I haven't had this opportunity to talk about how any impact, effect, achievement, accomplishment I have had on the field of Western American history comes straight out of my Western Civ class in 1968 when I was 17 years old. And my teacher, Professor Jasper Rose. So I have never had the chance until now to say how much that course changed me. I'm very proud to say I just got a year ago, my Center of the American West got an $800,000 grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in applied history to help young folks with recent PhDs figure out how they can change some of their customs and strengthen some of their customs in academic training to go out into the world and try to help with this managing of contention, generational transition, and so on. So that's how I'm spending my days now, and it's really lucky. Wouldn't have happened without the Western Civ class. Here are just a few things that I took away when the course ended in the spring of 1969. Here's stuff that was furniture in my mind that would last for me and help me in many situations and save me from failures of judgment and understanding that I was ready to fall into. Grace and sin coexist. I learned that in Western Civ. And to think that that anyone would be able to devise a plan for the future or a way of looking at the past in which you separate grace and sin, where you separate the positive and the negative and segregate them from each other. Don't waste your time on that. Figure out how to see the interrelationship and to appraise both of those. And a kind of corollary of that, if our heroes must be entirely beyond reproach, we will have no heroes. I'm going to have to be really fast here because I got to get to Herodotus. So tragedy is a feature of human life, a third thing I took away. And sometimes it is useful to contemplate tragedy in history and to try to figure out who was to blame for that tragedy. But often that does not help much, especially when, and it's remarkable how this keeps going on, if the perpetrators we are fixed on blaming died decades or centuries or millennia ago. Statute of limitations has surely got to apply there, and it's a strange and futile exercise to work on blame at that. And then ideals often prove to be poorly aligned with conduct. Sometimes that is the occasion for anger and bitterness when ideals, and especially the oratory attached to ideals, goes in a different direction from the conduct in history. It can be an occasion for anger and bitterness, but that is a temptation to resist. Then, moving along here, that an obstacle to our full reckoning with American history and its complexity, especially with slavery of African American people and the invasion and conquest and relocation of Indian people, a huge obstacle to that is a claim on innocence that a number of Americans are very committed to, and I swear to you that it's very awkward and not right to just think I can speak for the dead on this, but that claim on innocence that we hear a lot in our times would have mystified the thinkers of the ancient world if they could be brought back for a visit. They would have thought, where did you get that notion? So when I finished my Western Civ class, I was talking to my professor, Jasper Rose, who was British, quite an eccentric fellow, and I said, there have been times in this course, Mr. Rose, where you seem to have a very dark view of human nature. And I don't know where, when you spoke of original sin, as it appears in Christianity, it seemed to me like maybe I'm sure I wasn't right, but I thought you might believe that. You might believe in original sin. And Jasper Rose, who was very British and had funny figures of speech, he just paused and looked at me and he said, just wait, ducky, just wait. So Jasper Rose told us to read Herodotus. And I don't think I read it all. I'm quite certain as a freshman I did not read it. But what I'm going to propose really quickly, and I know I'm 3 minutes away? Yeah, okay. So I have shown it to my two co-speakers, and they have never seen a more closely annotated book in their lives. It is really all marked up. That didn't happen when I was a freshman, but I was clever enough as a freshman to leave thinking, I'll come back to this, I swear I will, and I have. So I have one big proposal to make, which is just see what would happen if in teaching American history, you periodically asked your students to engage in time travel and to go back 2,500 years and let this person who is so present in this text, in the histories, I don't know Greek, so I'm only in translation here, just every now and then juxtapose a Herodotus quotation, do whatever you can think of to get the students to think what 2,500 years means. So that is not intuitive. And to think that this person is speaking to us from 2,500 years ago is so astonishing. And he sets a framework, and I have to be really quick in doing this, and it mortifies me to do it because I'm betraying my love for the man. So, okay. So let's say that we are concerned about, we want to talk about Congress and decision-making and how we've landed in the situation we are, but what Congress was before it, contention, and so on. Here is a passage that, first of all, it's very good, maybe especially for college level. Here Herodotus is, in book 1, he is writing of the Persians, and he notes, first of all, that they make a big deal of their birthdays, and then he concludes the discussion of their birthdays. By the way, I disagree with the notion that Herodotus only wrote about great men. No. He wrote about all kinds of people because he was so entranced by people. Anyway, here we have the Persians at their birthdays. They are very fond of wine, and no one is allowed to vomit or urinate in the presence of another person. Well, the college students will, not your students, don't do that. Then, here is, in terms of decision-making in our time, this is an idea you think, well, we've tried other things. If an important decision is to be made, they discuss the question when they are drunk, and the following day, the master of the house where the discussion was held submits their decision for reconsideration when they are sober. If they still approve it, it is adopted. If not, it is abandoned. Conversely, any decision they make when they are sober is reconsidered afterwards when they are drunk. So, there are people who think the classics are boring. We must rescue those people. Then I swear I'm just going to do one. It's so hard for me to do this, and maybe at lunch I'll just sit by myself with my annotated collection, and people can be kind to me and come up and say, what other quotations did you want to use? So, and I swear, this is my last, oh no, okay, I have two that are just so great. This is, in Western American history, water is really, really important. And we have, and it is, of course, for the whole United States. So in American history, you do it. At some point, you have to talk about water. So this is a group of people, the Parthians, who depend very much on abundant water supply. And if they have a season without rain, they are in big trouble. When, therefore, they find themselves waterless, they go in a body with their wives to the Persians and stand howling in front of the gates of the king's palace until the king gives orders to open the sluices and allow the water to flow to whichever tribe it may be that needs it most. Howling in front of the kings. Well, we do that, but not quite so explicit or so well understood. And then I swear this is my last one because we have a system of primaries that go on forever. And it's hard for anyone to think. We'll hope for the political scientists to help us with that, but we do have this madcap project of these endless primaries. And so here we have the Spartans who have been approached by another group to engage in an alliance. And the people who are trying to persuade the Spartans give a very, very, very long speech. The Spartans, however, at this first setting, answered the speech by saying they had forgotten the beginning. Sorry, that's so beautiful. Okay, they answered the speech by saying they had forgotten the beginning of it and could not understand the end. And so the Samians had to try again. At the second sitting, they brought a bag and merely remarked that the bag needed flour, to which the Spartans replied that the word bag was superfluous. So here are the Spartans. I won't keep going, but this goofy group keeps trying to persuade the Spartans, and the Spartans keep saying, and your point is? So months and months and months of a primary season, time to think about the Spartans. So I do think that we could have a very fine project in putting intergenerational transitions at the core of our study of American history and then cruising right into the present and saying to my fellow baby boomers who are a little bit dominant in some of these old fights that we continue to have about how to put fragmentation behind us, say to those people, would you like to learn something about firefighting? Why am I saying that? Because I do have a wild life where I commute into public audiences. I spend times with people with the Forest Service. Every firefighter is taught the acronym LCES, Location, Communication, Exit Strategy, Safety Zone. You don't go into a fire, you do not go into a wildlands fire until you have thought of all those four things. So, hey, baby boomers, LCES, Location, Communication, Exit Strategy, Safety Zone. Boy, would that make a difference. Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity.
So I'm the political scientist, so my comments will have a bit of a different flavor, I guess, from the other two panelists. But a lot of what Professor Limerick was saying, I think you'll find some resonances of that in my presentation as well, and I'll try to point those out as they come about. So my school at ASU has been part of a group of organizations and institutions that recently received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the U.S. Department of Education to study the way in which civic education is occurring across the nation. So to perform a national study of civic education. And of course, teaching American history is a crucial part of civic education, probably the core of it in many ways, or a central part of it. So we've been looking quite a bit at that over the last 3 or 4 months. How is American history being taught in schools? How should it be taught? How can we come to grips with reconciling the various different ways in which American history is taught in schools? Because this is a crisis of sorts, I think, in our society today, that students, by and large, are not coming out of 12th grade and college as well with a sufficient understanding of what it means to be an American citizen, of what the narrative of American history is and means to them, how they fit within it, all of those sorts of things. There's just a real lack of understanding there. So we're trying to see what we can do to improve that. So one recent article, news story that came out just a few days ago, like a week or two ago, was this headline from a CBS News report saying that we have 50 different states and 50 different ways of teaching America's past. So they looked at all of the different ways in which American history is being taught in classrooms, K-12 classrooms across the country, and the story is about how different these American history textbooks and classes are across the country. This follows up on a New York Times article that came out a month or two ago that compared California and Texas, the textbooks that those states adopted for teaching American history, and pointed out some key differences between the two in the ways in which they were teaching American history. And these differences weren't contradictions. They weren't teaching opposite things. They were just teaching different sides of history, right? Different emphases on the same events and actors and figures in American history, but in ways that could give students a pretty different picture of what it means to be an American, of what American identity is, of how to understand American history and what their role as an American citizen is. And so one might argue that this is a problem, to have 50 different ways of teaching American history in the United States. One could also argue that to some extent it's a good thing to have some variation, local, regional variation on the way American history is taught and the way citizenship is taught. We live in a country where we value federalism, right? And local differences and local control, and those things are important. But certainly when it comes to civic education, educating American citizens and teaching American history, I think there's a good case to be made that there needs to be some degree of uniformity or common ground, baseline level of understanding that we all share no matter where we live within the United States. So this could be viewed as a problem. Now, the topics that tend to give rise to these different ways of teaching American history tend to be, controversial topics, and they sort of cluster around a few of these big topics. And I'll just mention a few of them. There are more. But one is, how do we teach slavery, Civil War, Civil Rights Movement, that long story of African Americans' struggle for justice and equality? There are different ways of teaching that story, and at every point along the way, there are different ways of teaching it. So the statement on the top, American ideals have inspired continual progress in racial justice and equality over time. And then the statement on the bottom there, the blue one, the effects of slavery continue to be pervasive in American society and politics. So I won't ask the audience to sort of raise your hand as to which of those statements you agree with. But I imagine many of us, perhaps, and I know I do, actually think that both statements are true, right? So in other words, that there are two aspects, two angles to the facts of American history with respect to these issues. There are different ways of telling the story that all have truth in them, right? Perhaps with different emphases, you might argue that the emphasis obscures the truth, or that it's not true to history at some point if you emphasize one side exclusive of the other. But I think both of these statements, many people would agree, could be true, right? But again, they don't often fall within the same narrative of American history. So usually if you see the one statement in a book, in a textbook, for example, you won't see the other. Or if you see the one statement emphasized, the other will be de-emphasized. And that was the case looking at the California and Texas textbooks, for example. It's not as if either one was giving a false picture of American history. It was just they were giving a picture of American history that emphasized one side of it or narrative at the expense of the other. And this speaks to a general historical fact that, Professor Limerick will be the expert on this, but it seems to me that, history, that there are facts and events in history that are indisputable, but there are also many ways of describing and narrating events and painting pictures of individuals that are not simply factual or that we can't observe directly, right? How do we evaluate a historical figure like a Thomas Jefferson or an Abraham Lincoln? That's not something that you can just prove factually one way or another, right? What this person was like and how we should evaluate them. That fits within a normative judgment and a narrative of American history and of human nature, right? So both of these could be true, but it's difficult to find them both in the same narrative story of American history. Similarly, let me go back up here. Similarly here, we the people, right? So a central concept of teaching American history and teaching American government is teaching the Constitution and what it means and its significance. The beginning of the preamble, of course, begins with we the people. The top statement there in red, the people of the United States are the legitimate foundation of the U.S. government according to the Constitution, right, as reflected in the preamble. Certainly that seems a defensible statement. The bottom one there are numerous and different groups of people in the U.S., each with their own unique histories and concerns, and perhaps grievances, right, and marginalizations and things like that. So the bottom statement, right? Certainly there are different groups of people in the U.S., immigrant groups of different racial, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, right? And they do have their own unique histories and concerns. So these two statements, again, are not incompatible with one another. They could both be true, but you will not generally find both emphasized equally or put in conversation with one another within the same narrative of American history, right? Normally, people who want to teach about the people of the United States from a constitutional framework are uncomfortable with the sort of problematizing of who the people are that the blue statement expresses there. It's uncomfortable because it seems to throw into confusion a bit what it means to be a unified people at the foundation of our Constitution and government. Now, it doesn't necessarily do that, but it makes people uncomfortable, right? And similarly, people who want to emphasize these histories of particular groups in the United States are not comfortable with the sort of unifying language of we the people. They think that could be a misplaced emphasis on the unity of the American people, when in fact we are a multiplicity in many ways. So again, two statements that might be true, that we might agree with both, but again, that have very different roles and very different narratives or stories of American history. Then let's see here, last one. Try to go a little more quickly on this one. Rights, right? So a lot of recent talk about the role of rights language in American politics. There's a famous book in the 90s called Rights Talk by Marianne Glendon. How we talk about rights has a very, very important effect on American politics and on our political opinions from the beginning, right, from the Revolution and before. Top statement, we are born with rights that the U.S. government is obligated to protect. That is a version of the statement from the Declaration of Independence, right? We're born with certain rights or created with certain rights, and it's the government's job to protect those. Bottom statement there, we have rights to various goods and services that the U.S. government provides. And so this is one way of thinking about the bottom statement, is it's a version of FDR's reinterpretation of the Declaration of Independence in his Commonwealth Club address. So in the New Deal in the 1930s, the end of the progressive era, when rights were redefined in various ways to be rights to things that the government provides, right? You might think of welfare rights as one example of this. Now again, these two statements and views of rights are not incompatible. We might have rights that we're born with and given by God, and we might at the same time have rights that the US government provides to us through law, right, and through various services. Those aren't incompatible, but if you emphasize the top sorts of rights, you are likely to de-emphasize the bottom sorts, and vice versa. In recent times, I think more of the emphasis has been on the blue, the bottom sorts of rights, perhaps to the neglect of the top, right? The rights that we are just sort of given or born with. But we might have disagreements about that. But at any rate, both statements could be true, but you will not find both generally in the same narrative. All right, so why is this? I mean, what does this say about our teaching of American history, about American history in general, and how does it relate to historical narrative? So one way of looking at history is in terms of what I'm calling here monumental history, and I didn't make that up, I've heard that elsewhere, but monumental history, picture Mount Rushmore up there, so the idea that what history is the story of the progressive march of important events that bring about human progress over time, right? And so we look at the great figures of history, like the ones up there. We really admire them. We praise them. We try to follow in their example. We talk about the great things they did, and we congratulate ourselves on our progress over the course of history, right? The progressive idea of history. We're getting freer over time and more equal and better. And what's important are the milestones, right? The milestones that we've hit on the way to ever greater freedom and equality, right? So the 13th Amendment, right? The Civil Rights Act, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., right? The greatest hits of American history. That's a version of what I'm calling your monumental history, right? Sort of the triumphal account, as it were. And then another way of teaching history, another side of it, is what some people call hard history, or the parts of history that we maybe would rather forget or not talk about as much. Perhaps the parts of history that don't offer lessons for us to emulate, that we wouldn't praise or build monuments to, right? In fact, we might take monuments down if we think that they represent parts of this hard history and we don't want to celebrate them, right? But it's all the in-between times of American history. In other words, so the time between 1619, right, to be a little provocative, and 1865, right, the 13th Amendment. Some of us might want to focus on the 13th Amendment and say, what great progress, right? This was an incredible moment. But then others would say, well, what about the time in between? What about the 200 plus years in between? Do you want to talk about that, right? And what can we learn from that? And that's a more difficult conversation. And it's not easy to see how we should put those two things together, right? How we should combine the monumental history with the hard history, right? So again, here, these are two sort of broad ways of narrating history in general and American history in particular. And it's difficult to find a history or a way of teaching history and narrating history that combines both in a satisfactory way. It's really difficult, I think, to do that. And I think one of the reasons why that is that history reflects human nature, right? And so this gets back to Professor Limerick's point about grace and sin, right? That there are these two sides, there are tragedies and triumphs, and human nature includes both. Human nature is complex. It's not simply good, it's not simply evil. And no individual in human history is simply good or simply evil either. So we make monuments to people, we want to idolize them and emulate them in various ways, but they're not perfect. Nobody is. And the villains of history aren't perfectly evil either. It's just easier for us to categorize them that way. And so I think that's part of the difficulty here, is that we have trouble writing American history in balanced ways because we have trouble understanding human nature and understanding how American history reflects human nature. And so I've got a couple of quotes up here. So teaching American history in full involves understanding human nature in full to some extent. And I think that's probably generally true of history. I think it's particularly true maybe in the American case, because I think that American history has been in some ways a more accurate and full reflection of human nature, sort of the drama of human nature unfolding over time, I think, than some other national histories. I think there are reasons for that. Starting a political society from scratch, and of course amidst various circumstances, some of which were unjust and terrible, some of which were hopeful and promising. But starting a political society from scratch, you see human nature sort of unfolding in slow motion. And that's not my idea. Others have thought of this before. Tocqueville and many others have commented on American history as a close reflection of human nature. But Frederick Douglass has this great statement here from a speech he gave called Our Composite Nationality. It says, nature has two voices, the one high, the other low. One is in sweet accord with reason and justice, and the other apparently at war with both. So he just speaks here to the complexity of human nature, the nuance in human nature, the fact that it has these two sides. And in his formulation, the two sides are actually at war with one another. So this is a really strong way of putting it, right? So that there's a conflict within human nature. And we might expect that to play out in history, in human history and in national histories, right? Seeing these two voices, the one high, the other low. Similar statements can be found throughout the founders' writings as well. Here we've got James Madison, right? So, as there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. So human nature is both to be distrusted and treated with circumspection, and it is to be esteemed and held in confidence, right? So this reflects the same sort of nuance and difficulty and tension in human nature that Frederick Douglass is talking about. And this is why I think to create a unified, true narrative of American history and to get both sides of it, I think that what's required is really a fuller understanding of human nature than we have as a society today, and then we teach our children in schools. And I think classical education has a really crucial role to play. And this, again, dovetails with Professor Limerick's presentation on Herodotus, right? And on just sort of looking at the ways in which human nature has not changed over the course of recorded human history. People like to talk about how different our lives are today. It's so complex, right? We have so much technology. Things are just they're totally different today than they were 200 years ago, especially different from 2,000 years ago. I think that's not the case. I just think that's false. I think human nature is the same as it's always been, and I think we see that clearly, and I think it's still the most important thing to understand if we're going to improve our politics, and I think it's the most important thing to understand if we're going to understand accurately and fully and teach well American history. So, thank you.
Philosophers have always been accused of having their heads in the clouds, whereas the historians are about concrete things. But as I was listening to the talks last night and this morning, I realized you're being presented with the philosophy of history by a historian. And so I feel very comfortable as a philosopher jumping in to a discussion about the philosophy of history. And you saw earlier the ages that were presented in different ways of doing history. But one of the things that they all have in common is they all involve humans, right? We're doing history about humans. Now, you could have humans that do history about non-human things. It's usually maybe called something else then, right? Like natural history or something. But we're normally doing history about humans. And in all of those different ages or different generations, humans have something in common, which is they want to understand. They want to find meaning. And so I'm going to be talking about that today. And I'm actually going to start with a prophecy. Does that surprise you from a philosopher? That would be a good story at lunch. They can ask you, which one did you go to? Oh, I went to one where I heard a sun devil give a prophecy. So they can't say that at a U of A. It's not the same if you say a wildcat gave a prophecy. A sun devil gave a prophecy. And it's actually a prophecy by another philosopher, so I feel safe in giving what is the Socratic prophecy. Socrates said this toward the end of the Apology. And now, O men who have condemned me, I would fain prophesy to you, for I am about to die, and that is the hour in which men are fitted with prophetic power. Me you have killed because you want to escape the accuser, and not to give an account of your lives. But that will not be as you suppose. For I say that there will be more accusers of you than there are now, accusers whom hitherto I have restrained. And as they are younger, they will be more severe with you, and you will be more offended at them. So here's the Socratic prophecy, which I think applies to all of us involved in teaching. Those he's speaking to were not able to give an account of their lives. And the prophecy is that their students will not accept this and will be much more severe with them than Socrates was. To give an account is the purpose of the academy. In any of the disciplines, they're all sharing that. This connects us to the word logos, which is, we still find this in some of the disciplines of the academy, right? The geologos, the geology, the biologos, the astrologos. No, the superstitious got that. We do astronomy, we had to get astronomy instead. The word history doesn't have that connection to the Greek word logos, but it does still have the same purpose, to give an account of human life and how humans have lived, the beliefs that have shaped their choices, to find meaning in that and teach that meaning to our students. If we cannot give such an account, then the Socratic prophecy will apply to us. And this is the account he has given himself at the end of his apologos. Are we able to find meaning, the meaning that is in history? I think that's what we'd find uniting each of the different kinds of approaches. They are nevertheless trying to find meaning. There's a self-referential nature to saying something like, don't give a universal philosophy of history because here's what history is, right? So even the postmodernists are involved in telling us what they think history is about. You focus too much on general rules, let's get to the particulars. Well, that has a self-referential problem if you make that then into a rule. But the thing that's a thread, the thing that's common for all of them, is this desire to find meaning. And to find meaning is the search for understanding. And we're especially looking in history to understand change. So we study the choices that people have made, and these tell us about their values and the beliefs that inform them. And that's where we begin to get to the uniqueness of human nature, in having beliefs and pursuing understanding. And values, and therefore beliefs, are often in conflict. So an individual person can have this conflict in themselves and read about that kind of thing in biographies, and people groups can be in conflict. History is the study of conflict, but not simply conflict, because you could maybe study the history of crabs on the seafloor going to war. When we get to humans, we're especially studying the outworking of basic beliefs in conflict. And I have an outline I'm going to use here. And I'll be referencing some of my work in my book, The Declaration of Independence and God, Self-Evident Truths in American Law. So human history has that special feature. We especially get to how humans have understood things, the study of how people have attempted to find meaning in their lives. We don't simply want to study experiences, but the meaning of those experiences. It's not a catalog of mere experiences. This gets us to the beliefs used to give meaning and how a person understands their own experiences. So I'll call these basic beliefs here, because they're the beliefs that undergird all the rest of a person's thinking. When basic beliefs are challenged and when they fail to provide meaning, they do not last. As we identify these beliefs and how they shape institutions and cultures and motivate the changes that we see over time, we're bringing history to life. We're giving it meaning for ourselves and for our students. That gets past simply the critique that it's a bunch of dates and names. Well, it does involve those things. And why? Why are they meaningful? So why do we study history? We can see, and we've seen in the talk so far, there are different ways to study history. You could do the history of ideas, the history of battles, the history of culture, storytelling. You could use it to learn lessons from our errors, and there's many more, right? But underlying all of these is history as conflict between basic beliefs. This is what motivates changes. It is beliefs that motivate and shape choices. And so this will underline any other approach. Any approach you get from a historian about what history is, well, it's going to involve that historian's beliefs, isn't it? So we can't escape the role of beliefs when we're studying humans and human nature. Part of the study is simply raising our consciousness and our students' consciousness about those, so they are able to identify them. They come to know themselves, is another Socratic dictum. Do you know your own basic beliefs? How you've thought about the world, and maybe you want to rethink those now that you're aware of them. We use these beliefs to find meaning in our lives. We can see how civilizations have been built on basic beliefs. That might be kind of the biggest unit in history, civilizations, down to the smallest unit, the individual. And many civilizations have decayed because they lacked meaning. Only that which retains meaning will last. So do we have meaning? Seems like a fair question to ask our students. Or are we in a process of decay? So now, permit me to use an example from my book that connects that question to our current context, from the Declaration of Independence and God. I've always been intrigued by the philosophical aspects of the famous statement, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It stood out to me that this is a government document. Can you imagine getting a government document like that, like a letter from the IRS that has those things in it? It's a secular document. It's not from a certain Christian denomination, for example. Even if there's a lot of historical work trying to trace the different founders' denominations, it's a secular document, and it grounds its arguments and claims about the nature of God and man. It's an example of natural religion. It is giving us answers to the questions, what is real? What has existed from eternity, and what determines human nature? And these are the areas in philosophy of epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. And we get this great unifying statement where we see the relationship between all three of those fields. And the statement also tries to tell us why. It answers the questions, how do we know? Well, it says these truths about God are self-evident. And now this is a problematic answer, and I'll come to that in some more detail later, but these answers aren't actually self-evident in the way that logical truths are self-evident. So perhaps it's more that they're common ground for the rest of what will proceed in their argument. And we can recognize a structure here. Arguments about rights or values rest on beliefs about what is real, God, human nature. And these in turn will rely on a theory of knowledge. Well, how do you know that about God or human nature? It gives us the order of epistemology, theory of knowledge, to metaphysics, what is real, to ethics, what is good. How do I know what is real, what ought I to do? But did it sufficiently establish these foundational answers? The centuries since that time have seen challenges raised at these points, and for many, those beliefs are no longer meaningful at all. Take an example from Thomas Paine. He challenged the meaningfulness of belief in God. Here he is at the time of the Declaration of Independence, voicing challenges that we still hear today from those who are called the new atheists. I always point this out, he did higher criticism way before the 19th century. We look at the New Testament, his work on the New Testament. Paine argues that we can know there's a first cause, but that's about all. This shows the problem in the ambiguity of the Declaration of Independence. What is meant by God the Creator? What is the meaning of this term? And has it been emptying of meaning since that time, so that it may be at best it's a first cause and maybe not even that? Can we know what is eternal? Can we know God? And those questions are right there for us if we study that and we think about American history since that time. So the study of history begins with learning to identify basic beliefs, and I'm going to especially focus on the belief about the good. That falls in the third one, the ethics portion. But it unifies the others. You can learn a lot about a person by knowing what they think is the good. This is their highest value. The summum bonum. That which they pursue above all else for its own sake. Once you know what a person's view of the good is, you'll learn a lot about what they think is real, about human nature, about how they know. So the Declaration of Independence gives us that framework. This can account for, as I said, much of human history after that time, and the challenges that have been raised American history, especially thinking about the challenges about human nature. But behind that are views and beliefs about what God is like. Theists, God the Creator and Redeemer. Deists, transcendentalists. That's a good one. You go home and say, I'm a transcendentalist now. So our students can be introduced to these ideas. If we did history and we didn't introduce our students to these basic ideas, and we didn't help them wrestle through their own answers to these, then we wouldn't have brought history to life for them. So how does this help us study changes in history? You might say, well, that's one document, Anderson. Well, let me give an example from another one of my books, Reason and Faith at Early Princeton. How do you understand changes in an institution over time, and do these reflect, you can then ask, do these reflect other changes in American education and culture? Princeton was founded, this might surprise you, I'm curious to see if it does. I was able to hold a seminar there, and I asked the students this question: did you come to Princeton for this reason? Princeton was founded for the purpose of teaching piety and the knowledge of God. I know that's why they come to ASU, but is that why they go to Princeton? Now, that's not its goal now. And so part of the change, part of the history of studying Princeton is, why did that change? The current goal, I double-checked this on their website, the current president says, our unofficial motto is service to nation and humanity. Notice the shift: piety and the knowledge of God to humanism, humanity. So piety, part of studying the history of that would be what happened. Well, challenges were raised between the First Great Awakening and now. A number of challenges were raised to the very idea of God at all. And what is piety? I don't know if that's even a term people use. And in classical education, who do you think of when I say piety? Sum pius aeneus, right? But he was pious towards an idol, a false god. So piety in itself is not a good. Piety has to be directed at truth. And that's why Princeton aimed piety and the knowledge of God. Truth. So the changes at Princeton were brought about by exposing a lack of meaning in those beliefs. That's both objectively and subjectively the case. It could be that subjectively they think they have no meaning when they do. And in history, that's one of the more important pieces, because then they turn away from it, even if there is meaning there. Now, James Madison, a Princeton grad, said that he didn't think we really need theistic arguments, and instead he emphasized something called common sense. William Tennant Sr., the founder of Princeton and one of the persons involved in the First Great Awakening, said something similar about common sense. That's what's important to the Christian life. And so you have assertions then about God and a de-emphasis on giving any proof. What's going to happen in the next generation? Do they like to be told things without proof? Do this. Believe in God. Well, why? Maybe there isn't a God. Now, I'm not up here right now. I'm teaching a philosophy of religion class right now where we're looking at the theistic arguments. Now we're not going to settle the matter, so to speak, but raise it as a reality, right? Does that belief have any meaning for the next generation and the next generation if there isn't any proof? Now, the founders of the country are focused on this worldly goods in the Declaration of Independence and providing a stable framework for pursuing those goods. God is needed as a source of equality, which gives rights, but not much more God is used for in that sentence. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison have their own personal beliefs in religion, different denominations, but they still agree on the secular framework. And this is one point that Madison made about the reality of factions. There will always be factions, he said, and a framework is needed for keeping them from having one of them oppress the others. This is a kind of skepticism about our ability to come to agreement on what divides us into factions. So before the postmodernism we heard about earlier, we have this skepticism, a form of what's called academic skepticism, already present in the heart of what was termed the modern age. We can't know. There will always be denominations, religions, and they'll always fight with each other. We don't really know the answer. See how that's skepticism? And then if you're in the position of telling the next generation you have to accept these beliefs, even though we can't really know, the general tendency of the next generation is to say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'll do my own thing. So this is part of studying change in history over time. Challenge to beliefs and helping our students see that same meaning. I suspect your students have beliefs about these things, have been told things by their parents, and have questions of their own about them. Now you might think, hey, he's just auditioning to have a philosopher in K through 12. Yes, absolutely. We need more philosophers in K to 12. So we can see how change works out in these kinds of conflicts, and then from there we can look and see how it affects change at those levels of meaning, affect institutions, affect people's lives, affect individual choices. We don't simply want truth as we study history. That was brought up earlier. Is this true? Yes and no. Well, it's because you're looking at truths, the many true things. We want the true, the definite article, the. What is true, especially about what is real, permanent, unchanging, eternal. This truth connects the many truths and helps us make sense of them. So you can begin to see why that structure on the Declaration of Independence is so important. Not just beliefs randomly organized. We want the relationship between beliefs. We call that either a system or a worldview. Beliefs come together. That's what the Declaration of Independence helps us illustrate. And so when we teach critical thinking, we're teaching critical thinking of worldviews as they're worked out in history between people. And when you look at any given conflict, some people like to do history as battles. Well, guess what? If it's battles between humans, it's because they have different beliefs about things. And they're arguing about that. Are we able to help our students understand why? One of the views of the modern is always a kind of snobbery that we've figured it out, and in the old days, they were really dumb. And so wars back then were just because they weren't very smart, and now we know not to fight about religion. Right? And so we have to help students overcome this sort of view of the past. I'm going to look again to Socrates as an example. There are many different versions of Socrates, and he might be used simply as an example of questions, but with the idea that we never actually come to know. And even when we think of the kinds of questions he asked, there could be different levels of questions. Not every Socratic question is equal. Some are more basic than others. But there's another version of Socrates as pursuing knowledge of the good, which I think is the essential version. So that acknowledging that he does not know is the first and necessary step in pursuing knowledge of the good. It's not a final step. Some people present him as the final skeptic, and the academy degraded into the academic skeptics. But no, he's starting that's the starting place. I don't know what is good, and I should know what is good. So I'm looking to him as an example of critical thinking about basic beliefs, an example of how to do history. Do we know how to pursue that question and think about the ways that historical persons, I remember that there was a picture of the different books that are used of famous people. I'd like to know that, what each of them thought was good. What was their highest good? Or if you were looking at battles, what is being fought about here? What can be brought to life for the students? So Socrates ended his defense with this prophecy I mentioned earlier. He said he was on trial because he'd shown that they could not give an account of their lives. And that although he would be killed, these others would come after him, the youth, who would say, okay, boomer, okay, Socrates. No, they would say, okay, sophists, you provided us with no knowledge or meaning. And that was the only inheritance we'd hoped from you. And so they're going to be more severe with them. So this question can't be avoided as we do history. We're doing history of humans, human nature, involved in wanting to know meaning. We can't avoid that. The only solution, Socrates says, is to improve ourselves by coming to know the answer. Be able to give an account of yourself. Be able to give an account of history to your students. History is full of meaning. So the questions that I've identified in this talk, in the Declaration of Independence, we can see similar kinds of questions being answered in the institution of Princeton. And I should say I didn't go to Princeton, and I don't have any family members that went there. I'm just hoping my kids get to go there if I keep talking positively about it. So we saw them challenged, moving from piety and the knowledge of God to humanism. Are we able to help our students understand those kinds of change? That might be a very specific change you never thought of studying yourself, but whatever you're studying in history will share those similarities in its place. And so we can continue, we can end with that Socratic prophecy. This is what we will be judged on. Do we help our students find meaning and give an account for themselves? Thank you.